There is a state that many empaths are experiencing right now, yet almost no one is naming it correctly. It is not exactly suffering, not exactly longing, and not entirely depression either. It feels as though something inside you has been drained, as if a portion of your life energy has disappeared without you knowing where it went. Many people label it as post-breakup, emotional trauma, or still not healed. But through the lens of psychoanalysis, the truth is far more uncomfortable. It is the sign of a psychological structure that has just collapsed. When the bond with a narcissist breaks, what is lost is not merely a person. What collapses is an unconscious attachment system you had relied on to sustain your sense of who you are. Sigmund Freud called the energy invested in that system libido, not merely sexual desire, but the life energy the ego needs in order to remain stable. And when libido is abruptly withdrawn from a familiar object, the ego does not simply hurt, it becomes disoriented. This is why so many empaths, after escaping a narcissistic relationship, do not feel relief. Instead, they feel empty, unmotivated, even silently panicked. Not because you are weak, but because you have entered what Freud described as a structural crisis of the ego following the loss of a libidinal object. And what very few people are willing to say outright is this: most human beings cannot tolerate this state. The year 2026 is not the cause of this collapse, it is the catalyst. A period in which collective psychological pressure, information overload, and social instability push the already fractured inner structures of empaths to their limits. In that context, only an extremely small percentage, perhaps around 1%, are capable of completing the withdrawal of libido, restructuring the ego, and continuing to exist without running back to old attachment patterns. This video is not about spiritual awakening. It is not about karma or the universe. It is about a cold truth of psychoanalysis. You do not survive the collapse of a narcissistic bond through emotional strength, but through your capacity to endure, having no object left to lean on. And if you are here, listening to these words, it is very likely that you are standing right at that point of transition where either the old ego disintegrates or a new structure begins to take form. To understand why a bond with a narcissist can cause an empath to collapse so profoundly, we have to move beyond the ordinary understanding of love and enter a deeper layer of psychology. From a psychoanalytic perspective, human beings do not attach to one another primarily through conscious emotion, but through a far more silent process, the investment of libido. Libido is not merely desire, it is the life energy that the ego pours into an object in order to maintain a stable sense of self. When you love someone, you are not only loving them, you are relying on them to feel that your existence is continuous and coherent. In the empath-narcissist relationship, this mechanism is pushed to an extreme. The empath often invests libido not only in the person, but also in the role the relationship provides. The chosen one, the needed one, the one who gives meaning to someone else's life. The narcissist, because of their inner deficiency, unconsciously encourages this investment. They do not love the empath as an autonomous subject, but as an external regulator of their ego. These two structures fit together in a dangerous way. The empath seeks stability through giving, while the narcissist seeks stability through being reflected. The problem is that, over time, the empath gradually transfers core psychological functions to the relationship itself. A sense of value, direction, and even emotional regulation no longer resides fully within the ego, but becomes dependent on whether the bond still exists. This is where many people misunderstand what is happening. They believe they are loving deeply, when in reality, they are anchoring their ego to an external object. When the narcissistic relationship collapses, whether through betrayal, abandonment, or even because you choose to leave, the experience is not heartbreak in the usual sense. What occurs is a sudden withdrawal of libido from a familiar object, a shock that Sigmund Freud described as having an impact equivalent to losing part of the ego's structure itself. That is why the feeling is not only sadness, but emptiness, disorientation, and a loss of vital energy, as if you no longer know what you exist for. This is why so many empaths, after leaving a narcissist, fall into a paradoxical state. Intellectually, they know they have escaped something toxic, Yet their body and psyche react as if something essential to survival has been taken away. Not because you are weak, but because for a long time your ego learned how to exist through that bond. When the bond disappears, the ego is forced to face a stark truth. It was never fully standing on its own. At this stage, most people unconsciously try to avoid the void. They reinitiate contact. They monitor the ex-partner's life. They rush into a new relationship or attach themselves to a rescuer role. Freud called this repetition compulsion the psyche's desperate attempt to recreate a familiar structure in order to avoid the sensation of disintegration. And it is precisely here that the number 99.99% begins to take shape. What makes 2026 an amplifying point is not a single event, but the simultaneous shift of multiple layers of psychological pressure. In psychoanalysis, the ego does not collapse because of one loss. It collapses when its familiar compensatory mechanisms fail all at once. That is the context created by 2026. As the pace of life accelerates, information floods in, and social instability persists, the ego is forced to operate in a state of chronic overload. The strategies that once helped you cope, staying busy, dispersing attention, self-soothing through external goals, no longer have enough power to cover the inner void. Under these conditions, empaths who have not completed the withdrawal of libido back into themselves enter a particularly dangerous state. They no longer have the old object to anchor to, yet they also lack the psychological resources to quickly construct a new one. Freud described this as the moment when the ego is laid bare, when the protective layers of habit and illusion are stripped away. In the past, the narcissistic relationship, however toxic, still provided rhythm, feedback, and a sense of having a place. By 2026, external pressure exposes the fact that these were only temporary supports, and when the supports collapse, nothing prevents the fall. Another factor that amplifies the collapse is the breakdown of collective emotional regulation. In stable periods, society unconsciously holds the individual through norms, schedules, and roles. When these frameworks loosen, each person is forced to self-regulate far more. For empaths, this is especially heavy. They are accustomed to carrying regulation for others, yet have not learned how to maintain emotional boundaries for themselves. The result is that collective pressure is not filtered, but poured directly into the nervous system, leading to exhaustion, numbness, or eruptions of nameless emotion. The year 2026 also exposes a paradox. The more one tries to be strong, the weaker the ego becomes. Many empaths respond by increasing control, extreme discipline, intellectualizing emotion, denying dependency needs, but Freud pointed out that excessive control is an energy-consuming defense. Under rising pressure, this defense quickly goes bankrupt. When it collapses, what surfaces is not strength, but long-accumulated fatigue. This is when people mistake the breakdown of defenses for "I am broken," when in fact the ego no longer has the fuel to play its old role. The final and most ruthless amplifier is that time no longer allows postponement. What could once be prolonged through compromise or silent self-sacrifice now demands a decision. Either you restructure or you repeat. But repetition in a new context no longer provides safety, it only accelerates exhaustion. This is why many empaths feel as if everything is collapsing at once, not because 2026 creates new wounds, but because it removes the escape routes. It is precisely in this environment that the difference between 99.99% and 0.01% becomes clear. The minority does not pass through by faith or willpower, but through a very specific capacity, the ability to tolerate uncertainty without rushing to find a replacement object. They allow the ego to remain incomplete long enough for a new order to form. The rest try to fill the void immediately with relationships, roles, or borrowed identities, and as a result, every rise in pressure pulls them deeper into the same cycle. In this state, the empath is no longer dramatic. There are no intense pains to cry over or retell. Instead, there is a strange emptiness. Not deeply sad, not genuinely joyful, not eager to connect, yet not wanting to return to the past either. Many mistake this emptiness for loss of motivation or losing oneself. In reality, it is the ego in the middle of restructuring, when old roles have fallen away and new ones have not yet formed. This is the phase in which the empath no longer feels drawn to being needed. Complaints and emotional demands from others begin to feel draining rather than activating the reflex to rescue. Not because the empath has become cold, but because libido is no longer flowing along the old pathways. And when life energy is no longer rewarded by the feeling of being useful, the ego is forced to seek another foundation for existence. What makes this phase frightening is the absence of external guidance. There is no one to confirm that you are on the right path. No feeling of uplift to cling to. Many empaths even begin to doubt themselves. Am I becoming numb? Have I lost the ability to love? Freud suggested that these very questions are signs that the ego is separating from dependency. When familiar reflections disappear, the ego is forced, for the first time, to look at itself without the eyes of another. Most people cannot tolerate this moment. They quickly reattach libido to a new relationship, a new spiritual role, a new mission that gives them a sense of meaning. But the 0.01% of empaths do not do this. They stay with that suspended in-between feeling long enough to confront an uncomfortable truth. Their value never actually required an object to confirm it. What once made them feel alive was not loving or being loved, but the flow of life energy activated through dependency. When that dependency ends, a deep silence emerges. Not an empty silence, but a silence in which there is no longer a role to perform. Here, the empath begins to lose interest in explaining themselves, in proving that they are okay, strong, or healed. They stop seeking to be understood, because the ego no longer needs reflection in order to feel that it exists. This is the moment when many empaths believe they are losing their identity. But Sigmund Freud would say the opposite. The old identity is dissolving because it is no longer necessary. What was once called "this is who I am" was, in reality, a set of survival patterns built around an object. When the object disappears, those patterns no longer have a reason to exist. This dissolution is not a failure. It is the condition for the ego to mature. The 0.1% of empaths who survive do not do so because they know who they will become. They survive because they accept not knowing, and they do not rush to fill the void with familiar forms. They allow themselves to remain in an unfinished state, a state Freud considered extremely rare, because it requires tolerating uncertainty without anesthetizing it through relationships or roles. It is precisely here that a true psychic shift occurs. No noise, no ritual, no light, just a quiet movement. Life energy begins to return to serve the ego itself, rather than flowing outward to keep others from collapsing. Most people never reach this moment. But for the 0.01% of empaths, this is the point of no return, because from here on, they no longer need a narcissist or anyone else to feel who they are. The year 2026, therefore, is not the empath's end of the world. It is a test of the ego's capacity for self-regulation after the narcissistic bond has collapsed. And in that test, only those who have stopped using other people as scaffolding for inner stability avoid being amplified to the point of disintegration. After the objectless phase lasts long enough, a shift begins to appear in the empath, but not in the form outsiders usually expect. There is no moment of "I have awakened," no sudden surge of power or confidence, and no urge to declare anything to the world. On the surface, the empath may even look more ordinary than before, less dramatic, less emotionally extreme. Yet this very ordinariness is the first sign that a new ego structure is operating. The most noticeable change is that the empath no longer reacts quickly. Situations that once triggered intense emotion, blame, indifference, ambiguity, no longer produce the urge to explain, fix, or rescue. This does not come from indifference, but from a deeper reality. Libido is no longer flowing along its old defensive pathways. When life energy is no longer pulled outward to maintain stability for others, the survival reflex loses its reason for existence. Empaths after restructuring often experience something quite strange. They no longer need to understand everything. Previously, understanding others, their motives, wounds, histories, was how empaths kept relationships and themselves safe. But as the new structure forms, that need dissolves. Not because empaths stop caring, but because the ego no longer relies on understanding to ensure its existence. This marks a crucial shift in psychoanalysis. from a defensive ego to a self-governing one. Another sign is that the empath is no longer swept into other people's emotional rhythms. They can still sense the atmosphere, still recognize tension or pain, but those emotions no longer invade and take control. Freud would say that at this stage, the ego has learned to maintain energetic boundaries not through rigid control, but by no longer investing libido in impulses that do not belong to it. This creates a new kind of stability, not intense, but durable. In everyday life, empaths after restructuring often experience a sharp reduction in the need to share their inner world. They no longer feel compelled to tell their story to be validated, or to explain why they have changed. This silence is not withdrawal. It is a sign that the ego no longer needs constant mirroring. For many people around them, this change is unsettling, because they were accustomed to an empath who was always ready to listen, explain, and adjust. But for the empath, this is the first time they do not feel guilty for not responding. A deeper shift, one that is rarely talked about, is that empaths lose interest in intensity-based relationships. In the past, they often mistook emotional intensity for genuine attachment. After restructuring, relationships that move too fast, feel too deep too quickly, or carry excessive emotional demands begin to feel draining rather than alluring. Sigmund Freud would see this as a sign that libido has withdrawn from dependency patterns and that the ego is no longer seeking vitality through emotional stimulation. The empath no longer needs the feeling of being needed in order to feel that they exist. This leads to a major shift in how empaths love, or more accurately, in how they do not rush to love. After restructuring, empaths often remain for a long period without forming deep attachments to anyone. This is not because they fear being hurt, but because libido is being reallocated back into the ego itself. Freud regarded this as a necessary phase of psychological maturation, in which life energy returns to strengthen internal structure before it can be invested outward in a healthy way. To outsiders, this phase may be misunderstood as withdrawal or distance. In reality, it is a sign of deep recovery. Another, more subtle manifestation is that empaths are no longer driven to be good. Previously, pleasing others, maintaining harmony, and avoiding conflict were unconscious survival strategies. After restructuring, empaths recognize that these strategies silently consume life energy. They begin to say no, without lengthy justification, and more importantly, without punishing themselves for it. This indicates that the superego has become less harsh, and that the ego has reclaimed decision-making authority. Empaths, after restructuring, also experience a change in their sense of time. They feel less urgency. There is no longer pressure to be okay quickly, to move on, or to prove that they have overcome the past. Freud emphasized that a mature ego has the capacity to tolerate delay without needing immediate resolution or gratification. This capacity now emerges naturally in empaths. They allow things to unfold at their own pace, without forcing or pushing. In work and creative life, empaths after restructuring tend to do less for recognition and more because it feels right. This significantly reduces psychological wear and tear. When libido no longer leaks through the need to be seen or validated, energy available for focus and depth increases. Many empaths are surprised to find that they do less, yet with greater effectiveness and sustainability. This is a direct result of the ego no longer scattering energy to maintain images or dependent relationships. One crucial point is that empaths, after restructuring, no longer seek closure in the old way. They do not need apologies, final explanations, or for those who hurt them to finally understand. Freud viewed the need for closure as a form of delayed attachment, where libido remains entangled with the object. When restructuring is complete, this need dissolves on its own, not because the empath has forgiven or forgotten, but because the energetic bond has truly ended. At the deepest level, empaths after restructuring experience a shift in their sense of self. They no longer define themselves, primarily through relationships, roles, or usefulness. The sense of who I am becomes quieter but more solid. This is not loud confidence, but a form of silent stability. Freud would describe this as the mark of an ego that no longer depends on external objects to maintain inner continuity. Because these changes occur quietly, many empaths do not realize they have crossed the most important threshold. They think they are unable to return to how they used to be, when in fact they no longer need to return. The old structure based on dependency, mirroring, and self-sacrifice has lost its operating foundation. The new structure is not dramatic, but it has one key characteristic: it is not easily manipulated. This is also the point at which many narcissistic narratives begin to reach for the empath again. The difference is that the empath after restructuring no longer responds as before. There is no panic, no intense fluctuation, no being pulled back into the old game, not because they have won, but because they have exited the system. And when someone leaves the narcissistic attachment system, the mechanisms of manipulation naturally lose their power. The most important thing to understand is this: empaths who survive the psychic shift do not become perfect or immune to suffering. They still have emotions, still experience fatigue, still have empty days. The core difference is that they no longer use other people to keep themselves from collapsing. Life energy now returns to serve internal stability, rather than being consumed to sustain structures that cannot stand on their own. And it is precisely this quiet change, not drama, not light, that explains why only 0.01% of empaths truly survive after 2026. Not because they are stronger, but because they have learned how to exist without needing an object to carry their psychological stability for them. After external conditions gradually settle, empaths enter a phase that few people recognize, yet one that is decisive. A phase in which returning to the old structure is no longer possible, even if they wanted to. This often brings confusion, not intense pain, but the unsettling realization that what once made them feel alive no longer works. Emotion-heavy conversations, intense relationships, grand promises all feel flat, not because the empath has become hardened, but because the ego structure no longer receives energy in the old way. Freud referred to this phenomenon as a shift in the economy of libido. When life energy has been redistributed back into the ego, objects that once triggered psychological pleasure no longer produce the same satisfaction. Empaths may try to return speaking with an X, entering a new relationship that resembles the familiar, but the internal response no longer aligns. Instead of connection, they feel tired, hollow, or even irritated. This is not a failure of healing. It is evidence that the old system has been deactivated. At this stage, empaths begin to experience a very different kind of loneliness. Not loneliness from lacking someone by their side, but loneliness from no longer finding themselves in others. In the past, being reflected through another person's eyes, emotions, or need was how empaths recognized who they were. When that channel of mirroring closes, the empath is forced to face themselves without any intermediary. Sigmund Freud considered this one of the most difficult trials of psychological maturity, because the ego must maintain its own continuity without leaning on an external object. Many empaths at this stage begin asking questions very different from before. No longer, "Why did they hurt me?" or "What did I do wrong?" but far more stripped-down questions. How do I want to live when there is no one left to save? What gives my existence meaning when I have no role? These questions do not have quick answers, and it is precisely the capacity to endure having no answer that continues the filtering process. Most people return to old patterns right here because they cannot tolerate an ego that has not yet taken a clear shape. Empaths who belong to the 0.01% do not rush to fill that void. They allow themselves to live in an undefined state, not because they are braver, but because the old system no longer has a way back. This is a crucial point. Many people think survival is a choice, but in reality, for the 0.01% of empaths, it is the inevitable consequence of the complete collapse of the old structure. They are not trying not to go back. They simply cannot go back anymore. It is precisely here that a new kind of stability begins to form slowly, quietly, but with great durability. Empaths realize that safety no longer comes from relationships or validation, but from the ability to be with themselves without panicking. Freud regarded this capacity as the mark of a highly mature ego, one that does not require constant stimulation to feel real, and does not collapse in the absence of external feedback. Another consequence of restructuring is a shift in how empaths understand suffering. Previously, suffering was often interpreted as proof of love, depth, or meaning. After restructuring, suffering loses its central position. Empaths no longer treat endurance as a measure of worth. This confuses and sometimes irritates those around them who were accustomed to an empath willing to sacrifice endlessly. But Freud would say this is the moment when the superego stops manipulating the ego through guilt. As guilt diminishes, a new kind of freedom appears. Not reckless freedom, but freedom no longer driven by the fear of losing connection. Empaths can leave situations that do not fit without constructing a rational story to justify it. They can be alone without feeling like failures. And most importantly, they can look back at the old narcissistic bond without feeling the need to prove anything, no need to win, no need to be validated as right, and no need to be understood. This is the point at which many narcissists directly or indirectly begin to sense the change. But at this stage, the empath does not need to notice that at all. Something far more important is happening. The ego is no longer organized around an external object, and therefore begins to organize itself around more internal values. Not moral ideals or lofty principles, but very basic ones. A livable pace, sufficient quiet, work that does not drain, and relationships that do not require self-betrayal. Freud emphasized that psychological maturity does not make a person happier in the conventional sense, but it does make them less disturbed. The same is true for empaths after restructuring. They do not live in euphoria, but they no longer fall into bottomless emotional pits. The emotional curve becomes flatter, but steadier. And it is precisely this stability that makes them no longer a suitable habitat for manipulation. From here, the story naturally moves toward another threshold, not about the empath anymore, but about how the old system reacts when it no longer has something to cling to. When an empath no longer mirrors, no longer regulates, no longer returns, whatever depended on them for survival is forced to reveal itself. But that is the story of the next part. At this point, what must be clearly stated is this: the empath does not become someone else. They return to a structure they never had the chance to develop before an ego that can stand on its own without self-sacrifice. And for that reason, the psychic shift of 2026 does not destroy them. It merely completes a process that began the moment the narcissistic bond collapsed. The moment a narcissist realizes that the empath has exited the system does not arrive as an emotional shock, nor does it take the form of explosive anger or despair. It unfolds slowly, quietly, and usually only after all familiar strategies have stopped working. There is no strong reaction to mirror, no emotion to regulate, no effort to explain or repair. The narcissist is not abandoned in the ordinary sense. They are deprived of an operating structure. In Freudian psychoanalysis, the narcissist does not attach to objects out of love, but because the object serves an ego-regulating function. The empath once provided a surface onto which the narcissist's libido could attach, sparing them from confronting their inner void. When the empath restructures and fully withdraws from that role, what is lost is not a person, but the ability to maintain ego continuity. The first sign of this moment is not action, but a disturbance in the sense of reality. The narcissist begins to experience unexplainable gaps. Emptiness not tied to specific events, restlessness without a clear object, attempts to seek feedback that no longer produce psychological gratification. Freud would call this objectless anxiety a state the narcissistic ego finds extremely difficult to tolerate, because it cannot be discharged through external control. What matters is this: the narcissist does not immediately understand what has changed. They may still believe the empath is merely being silent, angry, or waiting. But over time, one fact becomes impossible to deny. The mirroring system has stopped functioning. Behaviors that once reliably triggered reactions, silence, ambiguity, push-pull dynamics now produce no fluctuation at all. And for the narcissist, no fluctuation means no clear sense of existence. The moment of realization does not arrive as a conscious thought, but through the repeated failure of familiar mechanisms. There is no longer an emotional response to regulate inner tension, no longer a soft enough object to absorb instability on their behalf. The narcissist begins to face the very thing the empath encountered earlier, an unshielded void. But unlike the empath, the narcissist lacks an internal structure strong enough to remain in this state. Sigmund Freud emphasized that when libido cannot find an external object, it is forced to return to the ego. For an ego that has developed in a distorted way around control and mirroring, this return is not healing, it is threatening. The narcissist begins to experience themselves as the source of unease, not because of moral guilt, but because the ego cannot tolerate having no one else regulate it. At this stage, the narcissist may undergo a very particular kind of realization. The empath is no longer someone who can return to the old role, even if contact occurs. There is no permeability, no micro-adjustment, no effort to maintain balance. The empath is present, if at all, like someone who has stepped off the psychological stage. And it is precisely this non-participatory presence that is most destabilizing, because it offers the narcissist nothing to grasp. What must be stressed is this. The narcissist does not suffer because they have lost the empath as a person. They suffer because they have lost a function. When that function disappears, the narcissistic ego is forced to confront a reality it has always avoided. It cannot maintain stability on its own. This is the moment many misguided analyses label as regret or awakening. But from a Freudian perspective, this is not awakening, it is a structural crisis. Unlike the empath, the narcissist does not endure a prolonged, objectless phase. They will attempt to rebuild the system as quickly as possible through a new object, a new role, a new narrative. But what has changed is this. The former empath is no longer an option. Not because the empath is stronger, but because the old system is no longer compatible. The empath's new structure does not allow narcissistic libido to flow in as it once did. The moment the narcissist truly realizes this, therefore, is not a clear thought, but a quiet conclusion. There is nothing left here to operate. No game, no loop, no mirroring. And this does not produce drama, but a deeply uncomfortable coldness, because it forces the narcissist to leave, not because they were defeated, but because there is no stage left. The crucial point is this. The empath does not need to know whether the narcissist has realized it or not. That realization no longer holds decisive value. Freud would say that a bond exists only as long as both sides continue to invest libido. When one side has fully withdrawn, all reactions from the other are merely aftershocks of a system that has already ended. And for that reason, the moment the narcissist realizes the empath has exited the system does not pull the empath back, does not ignite intense emotion, and does not open a new dialogue. It only confirms something that was already complete. This bond has died at a structural level, not merely an emotional one. From here on, the story is no longer about who won or who lost, nor about who understood first. It becomes a cold but clear truth. When the empath no longer carries the regulatory role for an ego that cannot stand on its own, that system must either collapse or attach elsewhere. And the empath at this point is no longer within the range of that collapse.